is guilty of all of this, the Democrat Party should pay reparations. By that time, the boos started coming in, and then he started giving a little bit of the history of the Democrat Party. And then there was at least one individual said, "You lie," which, of course, he was not. He was just simply talking about some of the facts. Anyway, we will have lots of fun, I'm sure, with Louis Gohmert on Thursday. And Penna Dexter will be my co-host for a little of that time, so that will be kind of a fun conversation as well. If you were with us yesterday, you know that we had Kelly Shackelford with us in studio for a while before he had to run on to his next meeting. And we talked about some of these Supreme Court cases. But one of the ones we haven't talked about, which I wanted to talk about this hour because it might have an impact, interestingly enough, in Texas. It's certainly a national issue, but it relates to just something that the Dallas City Council did a while back. And so I want to, first of all, explain the case. And this comes from our good friends at the Rutherford Institute. And it may be a good example of where Kelly Shackelford is glad that years ago, when he did work for the Rutherford Institute, he started what at the time was the Free Market Foundation, later became Liberty Institute. So he didn't have to talk about these cases because the Supreme Court actually struck down the government's claim that it can censor speech. And so this is a free speech case, but it has to do with the fact that they said it is unconstitutional to reject a trademark, even when the trademark, I should say, is immoral or scandalous. And so they said the government violated the First Amendment when the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office rejected a trademark application for a streetwear brand, which actually, if I were to say the word, the FCC would be upset about it, but it starts with the letter F, and you can kind of figure out where it is from there. And it isn't exactly the word. It's slightly changed. And, of course, the argument was as well, that's not necessarily a swear word, but it's only one letter off, and everybody knows what it's supposed to mean. And you've figured it out by now. So the argument was that even though you may not like the trademark in this particular case, that this particular band had, it was an acronym, by the way, you can figure it out, Friends You Can Trust, that is still not enough to ban that. And so the Rutherford Institute, and that would be John Whitehead, who's been on the program with us a number of times before, actually filed a brief challenging the statute, saying that it violates the fundamental First Amendment guarantees. And so as a result, this particular ruling says that you can't condemn something in terms of its First Amendment, even if you disagree with the impact that it might have, or that it might be seen as scandalous, immoral, depraved, whatever word you want to use. And that relates very much to what is unfolded here in Dallas. Those of you that do not live in Dallas, let me mention that a while back, and we're going back, I think, 2 years, something like that. They're almost 3 years now, I guess it is, that you had an expo event, which was called, and I can use the word Exotica on the air. I don't think anybody's going to have a problem with that. And it was Exotica spelled with 3 X's. You can figure where we're going with there. And so the city council and others decided that they would go along with preventing them from actually holding the event. Actually, I think the decision was made by the K. Bailey Hutchison auditorium, but then the city council backed that. And as you may know, then a federal lawsuit was filed against the Dallas City Council because they prevented them from holding this event. I believe this could have been won in the court, but I think the decision on the Dallas City Council was simply, let's just pay some money and let it go away. So they approved a while back a $650,000 settlement to Exotica because they did not let them hold an event in the auditorium, in the convention center, those kinds of things. Well, I think you can see with this latest ruling from the court, this is going to, I think, make it even more difficult for individuals to reject something. You can think right now of some of the billboards. You ever travel down I-35 and see some of these billboards for like gentlemen's clubs and things like that? Well, there are indeed billboard companies that could reject that, but now going to be a little bit more difficult to do that. And I recognize that most of those are a little more tastefully done. I mean, you can turn yourself into a pillar of salt just walking down a mall and seeing some of the kinds of things that even are there with Victoria's Secret. But the point I'm making is this decision by the Supreme Court, which says that even if you think the speech is immoral, decadent, scandalous, obscene, you really still can't strike it down. And so in some respects, that tells me the next time a group like Exotica wants to have an event at the convention center, pretty sure it's going to take place. Anyway, it just shows you the impact that something like the Supreme Court decision can have on local municipalities. And I just thought I would take a moment to talk about another one of those Supreme Court cases that, frankly, we're not going to talk about anymore right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A year ago, the FCC commissioners implemented the Restoring Internet Freedom Order. At the time, critics were making apocalyptic predictions that this attempt to roll back the net neutrality rules would destroy the Internet. That is why it's worth taking a moment to see the effects of this FCC action. At the time, I suggested that these dire predictions didn't make any sense. After all, the net neutrality rules were only implemented near the end of the Obama administration. The Internet survived more than 2 decades without these rules. How could you logically argue that removing these 2-year-old rules would destroy the Internet? And I also suggested if there was a problem, the FCC or even the FTC could step in at some point in the future to fix the problem. Tom Giovannetti at the Institute for Policy Innovation makes a convincing case that the sky didn't fall. Progressive activists, he explains, were demanding that the government would implement broadband regulation. The Obama administration decided to apply to Internet providers various regulations that were written in the 1930s for the analog telephone monopoly. Experts at the time warned that these regulations were unnecessary and would most likely have a harmful impact on broadband investment, and that's what happened. Broadband investment dropped significantly in the 2 years after the Obama administration implemented these regulations. Once the FCC removed the regulations, broadband investment grew by $3 billion in 2018. Tom Giovannetti adds that broadband investment matters because broadband companies are among the biggest investors in our economy. If you look at the numbers, you can see that the sky didn't fall. Instead, removing the regulation stimulated broadband investment. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me talk a little bit about the Supreme Court since we were already doing that a minute ago. Karen popped her head in and said that we had somebody on Facebook saying, you keep talking about the lemon test. What is the lemon test? And I have a commentary coming out next Tuesday that goes into more detail, but you want to know right now? That's a reasonable question, so let me see if I can answer that. You go back to 1971. That is a long time ago. As a matter of fact, even had Lathan Watts in here Friday. He says, I've never lived in a time where we've actually had true religious freedom. because the Lemon Test, which was implemented in 1971, actually happened before I was born. Why is it called the Lemon Test? It has nothing to do with lemonade or anything like that. It was Lemon versus Kurtzman is the name of the particular Supreme Court case. And back then, you had a number of more liberal justices who sort of believed that we should actually have a separation of church and state. The phrase separation of church and state is not in the Constitution. As a matter of fact, the words church, state, separation are not in the Constitution, which most people are shocked to find out. But nevertheless, there was an idea that was implemented back in the 1940s, actually 1947, that said we should have a separation of church and state. And so there was a big question about, okay, the Supreme Court has to rule on whether or not this First Amendment, which says we should not have an establishment of religion, what does that mean? And so the justices back then, in this case, involving Rhode Island of all things, concluded that you could use a three-part test, so-called Lemon Test, to determine whether there was an establishment of religion. And as Kelly Shackelford aptly explained yesterday, that test set such a high bar, if you will, for something that would be not constitutional, that what it essentially did is allow the court to rule that almost anything that involved religion was unconstitutional. And it led to some really silly things. Let me give you the test so you can kind of see how crazy they got. One of the tests was that the federal statute must have a secular legislative purpose. So if you're talking about a bill, it had to have a secular purpose. Since this came out of Rhode Island, later on they had a ruling that said, well, you know, we have these Christmas creches in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. What's the secular purpose of a nativity scene? I'm not so sure there is one. So that's where they started saying, well, the secular purpose is just to commemorate Christmas. And as long as the nativity scene also had Frosty the Snowman, Santa Claus, this is where they started counting up the number of reindeer, you know, then that made it okay. So first it had to have a secular purpose. Number two, its primary or principal effect, I guess it was actually worded this way, its principal or primary effect must be one that neither advances nor inhibits religion. Well, could you argue that a valedictorian that mentions God, well, is that valedictorian, is he or she advancing religion? Her religion, maybe. So you can see where that gets you into trouble. And was a nativity scene on the grounds, does that advance religion? Well, you could maybe argue that maybe not in that case. And then the third was that the statute itself must not foster excessive government entanglement. And that was one saying, well, is the government somehow entangled in all of this? Because the government is entangled because it's mowing the lawn around the nativity scene, or there's lights on the nativity scene, and so, well, the government's entangled because they're paying the bill for it. I mean, you can see how bizarre it gets. And the point I'm making about the Lemon Test was simply this. What it did was prevent any real religious freedom, because almost anything could, on one of those three tests, could possibly then be declared unconstitutional. And in order to pass the test, you had to pass all three. Whereas now, as we'll talk about, the decision that came down from the Supreme Court, it says actually if it has historical significance, or if it has an event, it does not entangle the government, or then it's obviously or rather than and. And probably the significant aspect of that comes down from Justice Neil Gorsuch, who actually just said, this is ridiculous, because what we have here is just anybody who could be offended by religious speech, by a religious display, would have a standing. And he said, I don't think these people have a standing in front of the court. They should not be able to bring suit. And he said what he wanted to try to do, and what he felt this court decision did, was rescue the federal judiciary, and this is his quote, rescue the federal judiciary from its sordid business of having to pass aesthetic judgment one by one on every public display in this country for its perceived capacity to give offense, unquote. In matter of fact, he went on to say, if you're looking for somebody to be offended, I love his line. In a large and diverse country, offense can be easily found. And so the point he was making is that, yes, if indeed your criterion for whether or not something is unconstitutional is whether somebody would be offended, you'll always find somebody offended. But back to the key point that was being made by the lawyers with First Liberty is that what you had is a situation with the Lemon Test, and now I'm going to quote from Justice Clarence Thomas, who said, really, the logical next step is completely to overrule the Lemon Test. Now, they did set it aside, but they didn't completely say you can never use it again. Theoretically, you could use it in some cases, but not in these kind of cases, because he said it continues to cause enormous confusion in the states and lower courts. And the example I use in my commentary coming out next week is the best way to illustrate that is just to look at the reams of paper. These are notebooks full of paper that were written by various lawyers to try to adjudicate whether this cross, this memorial cross that was erected almost a century ago, should be bulldozed down because we might offend a few humanists. So I probably took a little bit longer in trying to answer that question than is necessary, but since you ask about the Lemon Test, that's what it is. That's what essentially has been set aside, although they are starving it, and it's going to die eventually, but it would be better if they took out the 45 and put it out of misery. But nevertheless, that's where we are in terms of that Supreme Court case, and that's why Kelly Shackelford, if you see him these days, has a big smile on his face and a light in his step because, first of all, he's been able to eliminate perhaps one of the most onerous tests that have ever been applied to the Establishment Clause. And if that isn't enthusiastic enough for Kelly Shackelford, the other case that might be going before the Supreme Court in the future would eliminate one of the worst tests that have ever been implemented on the free exercise case. That's the so-called Smith decision. So after the break, I'll get back into a couple of other issues, but since you wanted to know about the Lemon Test, I'm always glad to answer that question. If you want to post other questions on Facebook, I'll take those. Of course, if you'd like to call us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. But as we go to a break, this would be a good time for you to call the call-in line or the order line, and I'll give that again in just a minute, because as we said, it's morning in America, and I thought as we come to the end of our fiscal year, it'd be good to hear from some of our donors.
Thank you for your program. I am a team member, and you have opened my eyes to the truth.
You have a wonderful program. I just want to thank you for being there. It's great.
I just wanted to call in and express my gratitude for the awesome work that you guys have done. I've been listening for about 6 months now, and it's just been something I can hardly miss. Thank you for giving me my daily dose of truth with a biblical worldview. I'd just like to encourage anyone listening that's inspired by Point of View to give what they can. I'm a California millennial and Christian, and I now can say I support Point of View.
Thank you. First of all, let me say I listen to y'all's show every day as much as I'm able, and I really appreciate the topics and conversation that y'all bring to the fore.
I listen to y'all's show a great deal, and I really appreciate what you guys do.
So again, just a great opportunity for you to participate, and we encourage you to do so. You heard one of those individuals say he's a millennial, and normally we have our Millennial Roundtable on Tuesday. Nick is out at the moment, and I'm covering, and actually this week we maybe want to postpone that anyway, but next Tuesday is the Millennial Roundtable, so I'd love to hear from some of you that are younger and could maybe at least give a one-time gift to support this ministry. Of course, you heard somebody there mention I'm a team member. That means they're part of the Truth Team, and they give as little as $1 a day, $30 a month, $360 a year. But whatever you might want to do to give on a regular basis or to give just on a one-time basis, let me encourage you to go to our website, which is pointofview.net. Click on that button that says Morning in America, and especially the button that says Give Now. We have a matching fund, which means your gift of $50 could be $100. Your gift of $200 could be $400. So let me encourage you, if you want to make a gift, we want to certainly make that an opportunity for you to double your investment. So please take the time to go to the website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to talk to someone, the order line number is 1-800-347-5151. We'll answer the phone and chat with you, and we'll take your credit card. Again, 1-800-347-5151 or pointofview.net.
How many times have politicians promised to defund Planned Parenthood? Vote for us, we'll do it, and nothing happens. Well, the current administration finally did something, and though it was temporarily blocked, last Thursday a 3-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit recognized the president's power, and around $60 million of our money was removed from Planned Parenthood. It was a ray of sunshine in what's becoming an increasingly tough fight. And with your help, Point of View Radio will be here to continue the winning. But that's the key phrase, with your help. Our fiscal year ends this week, and to make plans for the second half of 2019 and the first part of the 2020 election year, we need your investment right now. Go to pointofview.net, click on the banner saying Morning in America, or call 800-347-5151. And your gift will be doubled if you give right now, thanks to a special matching grant. Pointofview.net, click on Morning in America, or invest by phone, 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again. By the way, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. That is, of course, the call-in line. You can use that at any time. It is the same number we've had for decades. I remember back in the 1980s when I first started as a co-host for Marlon Maddox. One time we did a rally, and at the very middle of the rally, he said, okay, now it's time for me to get some questions, but it's just like when we call the number, and that number is, and the entire audience in unison said, 1-800-351-1212, and I was saying, wow, I guess they know the number, don't they? So that has been the number. It probably always will be the number if you would like to call in. The other number I gave just a minute ago is slightly different, and that is the order line number. If you'd like to order materials, some of the booklets we have, the brochures, all sorts of things that we have, including some of my books, or if you would like to talk with someone to make a donation, and we can do that very quickly. We simply get your phone call. We get your credit card number and basic information. You don't miss more than about 2 minutes of the program, and it's 800-347-5151. And sometimes people say, well, what am I supporting? Well, of course, you're supporting a radio program that has been on since 1972. It's been up on satellite since the early 1980s. I've been doing it since 1986. Was that make me a host or a co-host for a third of a century, which is older than some of the interns I'm looking at right now, if nothing else. But again, you're not only supporting the radio program, but as you go to the website, you'll see some of the videos we've posted, as well as, of course, we post every single day the podcast of the interview we do, the YouTube video, which we are back up on if you have missed it the last couple of days because we had a little bit of glitch, but we solved that. And even my Viewpoints commentaries. The one today is entitled Net Neutrality, and I won't spend a lot of time on it, but encourage you to get it if you did not. And the reason I did so is that today is basically about a year after the decision made last year when the FCC commissioners implemented what was called the Restoring Internet Freedom Order. And that is the decision being made by, at that time, the FCC commissioners to remove the rules called net neutrality. Now, net neutrality was something that was implemented in the latter years of the Obama administration. And back a year ago, I remember conversations we had even in the studio with callers and others about this is going to be the end of the Internet. And even at the time, I said, look, these were just implemented a couple of years ago. The Internet survived for more than 2 decades before these rules, which were actually taken from some of the rules written to the analog telephone monopoly in the 1930s and not really applicable. The Internet survived quite well without these rules. And even if you argue that this is going to cause a problem, don't you think the FCC could then go back and re-implement those, or the FTC could step in? And, of course, the reason I wrote this is because a good piece came out the other day by Tom Giovannetti, who's with the Institute for Policy Innovation. Of course, works with our friend Dr. Merrill Matthews, who'll be with us on Friday, in which it was entitled The Sky Didn't Fall. And exactly what everybody predicted at the time is what happened. Not only was it not hurting the Internet, it actually had a tremendous impact. Last year alone, investment in broadband increased by an additional $3 billion. $3 billion. And even Tom Giovannetti points out that broadband investment matters because broadband companies are among the biggest investors in our economy. So it was helpful for those of us that use the Internet, which is like most of us, but it was also helpful for the economy. So anyway, if you'd like to read that, it's, if nothing else, a warning that when you hear the doom and gloom, and you're going to hear a lot of it tomorrow night and Thursday night at these Democratic debates that will be taking place, you got to take it with maybe not even a grain of salt, but a whole bag of salt. And lots of times when people are predicting the end of the world just keeps going and it doesn't end. Let me take one other issue while we have been talking about the Supreme Court. This one is not a Supreme Court case yet, but it's a religious liberty case. and we'll see where it goes on this, and that is this piece by Todd Starnes, National Guard bans Christian scouts because of religious beliefs. The National Guard facility in Pennsylvania refused to allow Trail Life USA scouting troop to tour their facility, and the reason, as Todd Starnes says, will blow your mind. He says, I write about these attacks on Christians in my upcoming book, Culture Jihad, How to Stop the Left from Killing a Nation. Anyway, the Guard facility there regularly gives tours to the Boy Scouts and the Boy Scout troops, which is now a very inclusive, and that's an understatement, very inclusive kind of organization. But Trail Life Boys is a Christian scouting organization. And if you say, I've never heard of it before, you haven't been listening to Point of View, because from time to time we've done interviews with the head of Trail Life USA, because I know a number of you say, I would love to have my young boy have a scouting experience, but I'm really concerned about all the decisions and all the compromises, all the moral compromises the Boy Scouts have done. So we let people know that there is a Christian-based Boy Scouts, if you will. It's called Trail Life Scouting. And so they have been doing very well. But the National Guard said they had concerns about whether the Christian group was supportive of the LGBT community. Now, why the National Guard would care about that, number one, and why the National Guard would want to treat a Christian Boy Scout group differently than a secular-like Boy Scout group, I don't know. But anyway, the interview that Todd Starnes did with the National Guard was, quote, after researching the organization online, it was quickly discovered that the organization restricted membership to certain persons. And it says, quote, Army values and policy prevent discrimination against gender or sexual orientation within our ranks, which in turn led to the first-level reviewer denying the request, unquote. So because if you are going to engage in same-sex, well, first of all, if you're engaged in sex at all, you're going to have a problem with certainly Trail Life USA, but especially if you're engaged in homosexual activity, you're not going to be in that group. And groups should have the freedom. It's called freedom of association. Read about it. It's called the First Amendment. But nevertheless, this was something that then caused the Army National Guard to say, I guess we can't bring in Christians. Really? So anyway, they launched an investigation to determine whether or not these Christian teenagers were gay-friendly. And Todd Starnes says, I wasn't aware that this was a prerequisite for taking a tour of a military facility paid for by the tax dollars of Christian citizens. So John Stemberger, who's the chair of the board of Trail Life, and I've interviewed him as well, including, of course, the executive director of Trail Life, and he said simply, requiring a Christian code of conduct does not equal improper discrimination. He went on to point out, Christian churches and organizations have never allowed their own members to promote views that are opposed to the clear teaching and values of the Bible. And you might be aware of the fact that Trail Life is something that is sponsored lots of times by evangelical churches that originally used to sponsor Boy Scouts, but then when the Boy Scouts began to compromise on a lot of different moral issues, they said, okay, well, we probably can't have a Boy Scout troop associated with our church anymore, but I know we'll have Trail Life as the alternative. And so that's the case. Well, anyway, the National Guard lifted the ban on Christian scouts after, are you ready for this? First Liberty Institute, have you heard them before? And the Independence Law Center, which is a group we probably need to talk with sometime in the future. I don't know much about them, but got involved. The law firms which handle religious liberty cases said the National Guard's decision to ban the Christian Scouting Group is discriminatory and unconstitutional. And so the National Guard said this, quote, it was not until after receiving the letter from the group's attorneys, that the issue was raised to the appropriate level for legal and full staff review. They wanted to say, quote, it was determined that granting a tour to the organization would not violate policy and should be permitted. The decision has been reversed and the tour has been granted. So another victory. Kelly didn't even spend the time talking about that. They've got so many things to talk about right now at First Liberty. This one is way back burner, but I thought it was pretty important, if for no other reason than we talk oftentimes with the head of Trail Life, and maybe we can do that again before the end of the summer. And I love how Todd Starnes ends his piece. He said, the idea that Christian boys would be banned strictly because of their religious beliefs is not only ludicrous, it's also illegal. And again, John Stemberger, who's been on the program with us before, said the bottom line is the original decision was still discrimination against these boys and their families because of their religion. This is simply un-American, unconstitutional, and just morally wrong. So if nothing else, Todd Starnes ends by saying, let's hope the National Guard has learned its lesson and will never again discriminate against citizens of religious faith. I'm afraid it's going to happen again, and that's why we have groups like First Liberty to address some of those issues. Another victory for Christian groups, and in this particular case, Trail Life USA. Let's take a break. We got a lot more to cover. We'll do so right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Lawsuits exist to redress actual injury, but it seems that some activists think lawsuits exist to resolve offense. Well, you hear it all the time. Recently, activists complained about the presence of a Bible at a VA medical clinic. A World War II veteran donated it. He was a prisoner of war and thought it was appropriate that the VA display it as a part of a POW MIA remembrance table at the clinic. Right on cue, an angry activist sent a letter claiming offense, demanding that this historic Bible be removed. First Liberty Institute sent a letter reassuring the VA that the display is perfectly legal. We reminded them that removing any Bible from any such display could not only dishonor the memory of the brave men remembered by it, but it might actually be unlawful. Offense is not a cause of action, and the Supreme Court of the United States agrees. In Town of Greece v. Galloway, Justice Kennedy, writing for the majority, explained, offense, however, does not equate to coercion. Adults often encounter speech they find disagreeable, and an Establishment Clause violation is not made out at any time a person experiences a sense of affront from the expression of contrary religious views. So if you ever get a threatening letter that is based entirely upon someone being offended by the presence of a religious item or symbol, just ignore it. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that we will spend a lot of time in the next half hour. We're talking with Charles Crismier about his book, Hearts of the Fathers. He actually makes a very strong case that fatherlessness in America is one of the big crisis points. That will be reiterated again on Friday when we have Colonel Allen West, who argues that the kinds of problems we deal with oftentimes in the African-American community, and since he's black, he can probably say it better than anybody, have more to do with the absence of fathers than it has to do with any kind of racism or discrimination. So we'll get into that discussion, and then in the next half hour after that, we will talk about this upcoming debate. We have all sorts of things being said right now. 2 nights, 5 moderators, 20 candidates. The question is, can NBC Network pull off a debate-a-palooza? So that's one of the questions that certainly has been front and center there. I'll talk a little bit about some of the rules for the first Democratic debate. And then this one from Politico, I love this. Democratic bigwigs fear the debates will devolve into a horror show, that eventually they fear that voters will be left with the impression of a bickering, small-minded opposition party. So we'll see what that might intend. And also one of the articles I'm posting here that came from The Economist, Democratic presidential candidates are making promises they cannot deliver. So we'll get into that for another moment or two. Since I was talking about religious liberty, let me just even come back to a commentary I wrote last week. And already it's becoming a little bit stale because the title of it was Religious Liberty in This Nation is in Limbo at the moment. And I pointed out is the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Jack Phillips, the Baker case, Masterpiece Cake decision. But then as soon as that victory came, when the Supreme Court returned the case back in Washington for Barronelle Stutzman, the Washington State Supreme Court just doubled down and said, no, we don't think we should change our ruling against her, even in light of what you did in the Masterpiece Cake decision. But since then, of course, we have had a number of things happen. First of all, the Supreme Court decided to vacate the decision of Aaron and Melissa Klein. This is the Sweet Cakes decision. Send it back to Oregon to reconsider. Now, they may also double down, so we'll see where that goes. But in addition to that, of course, we've also had the ruling we just talked about a few minutes ago that actually got rid of the lemon test, which I talked about earlier this hour, and did some things which are going to significantly advance religious liberty. And then, of course, we also can mention some of the actions being taken by executive order by the Trump administration. One of those that I mentioned in the commentary about a week and a half ago was the Department of Health and Human Services announced rules that protected health care professionals who might refuse to participate in morally questionable practices. But I think the future of liberty depends in large part on who the next president is, because this president has been putting people in the federal judiciary, both on the federal court, the circuit court, and of course, 2 on the Supreme Court, that actually believe in religious liberty. We will, I think, have a better understanding of how some of these Democrat candidates feel about religious liberty after Wednesday night and Thursday night. I think I know the answer to that. So we'll see where that all plays itself out. But nevertheless, as we say on our website, it is morning in America. Well, just before we take a break, let me use this piece from the Babylon Bee. You got to love the Babylon Bee. We actually have had one of the writers for Babylon Bee on the program. We need to get some of the others on here, but this one, if you haven't seen it, the Apostle Paul's King James Bible up for auction. And kind of fun. A new eBay listing confirmed Tuesday that the Apostle Paul's leather-bound edition of the King James Bible, the only translation he was known to use, is at long last up for auction. The $10 million reserve has quickly exceeded as excited Christians from around the world began frantically driving up the price in hopes of owning a little piece of church history. And then I love their last 2 paragraphs. This is so good. Here's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to read the same archaic English that the Apostle Paul did in his daily personal studies, the auction listed. You can own the majestic text of the 1611 authorized version used by the church fathers to found the Christian church. Free economy shipping, no returns. And the owner of the historic heirloom also stated that the Bible is in use, but good condition, with all of the Schofield study notes still clearly visible at the bottom of the page. One of the great writings of the Babylon Bee. Actually, it's amazing to me that it took till 2019 for them to come up with that. That would have been one of the first ones that might have occurred to me in light of so many people that are convinced that the King James Bible was the one that the Apostle Paul used. But nevertheless, just thought you'd have a little bit of fun with that. And when we come back from the break, we're going to talk about the importance of fathers, the danger of fatherlessness, something to remember as we then, in the latter part of the first hour, spend some time talking about the Democrat debates. I'm going to talk about the rules, the moderators, the candidates, those kinds of things. And then in the third hour, as I mentioned, Craig Parshall will be with us as we talk about Iran. And we also have information about a book that he co-authored with Tim LaHaye, Thunder of Heaven. And I think that will get us into not only the very significant showdown between the U.S. and Iran right now, but also what maybe some of the prophetic significance of that might be. Also, I want to get into a little bit, if you'll permit me, to talk about some of the Muslim eschatology, which, by the way, is a little different than the Christian eschatology. They do believe that there will be trumpets that will sound, and the first trumpet will be when Allah destroys all human beings except those that Allah actually considers privileged. The second trumpet is when there'll be the resurrection of the dead. But then they believe in a kind of a tribulation, but it's a 40-year tribulation in which people will wander the earth naked and confused, and eventually there'll be a final judgment. And, of course, Jesus will come back and establish the religion of Islam. Yeah, it's hard to believe some of that. But just before we take a break, let's, if we can, talk about the fact that, indeed, we encourage your financial support. Here's what some of our listeners have to say.
Point of View is a part of my daily life, and I know of no other radio program that helps its listeners to develop, articulate, and then defend a biblical worldview as successfully as yours does. For those reasons, I consider it an honor to be able to support Point of View financially, and I would encourage all of your listeners, both young and old, to prayerfully consider doing the same.
I just turned your program on, and I want to just let you know I was working in an abortion clinic when abortion first became legal, and I thought I was helping women. And the Lord showed me in a very powerful way, as he removed the veil from me, what exactly I'd been involved in. And I am proof of forgiveness. And I want to just let you know how much I appreciate just getting the truth out.
I really appreciate your program. I don't get to listen to it every day because I have to work, but it's really a blessing to me and to all of us.
You know, my husband and I take so many extra precautions to guard our children, and it is a huge effort on the part of Christian parents to do that. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
I just appreciate all you guys do. I mean, I learned so much, and it's amazing what you teach that I say to other people, and they look at me like, where did you hear that? So I appreciate you guys. So thank you for all you do.
Most of the time, you probably had some people say, yeah, where did you hear that? Well, I guess I heard it on Point of View. And if you've benefited from some of the things you've learned on Point of View that you've heard nowhere else, can I ask those of you that maybe have been listening to the program for some period of time to support us? We recognize maybe only about 1% of the entire listening audience ever sends in a gift. I'm talking to some of you that are in the 99% category. Could you maybe just send a one-time gift? Again, it is very easy to do. Go to the website, pointofview.net, click on the button that says Give Now. We have a matching fund, which means your gift is doubled. And if you would like to talk to someone, of course, we also will, again, mention that number. It's 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. We'll be back right after this.
How many times have politicians promised to defund Planned Parenthood? Vote for us, we'll do it, and nothing happens. Well, the current administration finally did something, and though it was temporarily blocked, last Thursday a 3-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit recognized the president's power, and around $60 million of our money was removed from Planned Parenthood. It was a ray of sunshine in what's becoming an increasingly tough fight. And with your help, Point of View Radio will be here to continue the winning. But that's the key phrase, with your help. Our fiscal year ends this week, and to make plans for the second half of 2019 and the first part of the 2020 election year, we need your investment right now. Go to pointofview.net, click on the banner saying Morning in America, or call 800-347-5151. And your gift will be doubled if you give right now, thanks to a special matching grant. Pointofview.net, click on Morning in America, or invest by phone, 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We have a lot to cover in the next couple of hours. We're going to be talking in just a minute about fathers and fatherlessness and the legacy that a father can leave. And then we're going to get into a look at the presidential debates that will be taking place Wednesday night and Thursday night. 2 nights, 5 moderators, 20 candidates. Some people say, can NBC pull off a debate-a-palooza? I'll talk a little bit about some of the rules there, and also the concern on the part of some of the leadership in the Democratic Party that these debates might devolve into a horror show. And we even have posted one article on just this growing list of promises being made by those candidates. So that will cover the first hour. And then we're going to devote an entire time the next hour to Iran. We will have Craig Parshall with us, of course, an individual that we have interviewed over the years on everything from religious liberty to the fact that, of course, he's written or authored or co-authored 12 different suspense novels. Matter of fact, we even offer his book today, Thunder of Heaven, because that deals a lot with Iran. And so we'll talk about some of the prophetic significance, some of the political significance. And so there'll be a lot that we will be covering in the next couple of hours. And if you'd like to join us at any point, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. New book came out last year, but we haven't had a chance to talk about it. I thought it was most appropriate to talk about near Father's Day, which, of course, has already taken place. Hearts of the Fathers, Leaving a Legacy That Lasts. Charles Crismier is with us, and he is the author of that book. We've talked with him in the past, for example, about his book, Renewing the Soul of America, for those that want to also gain some great insights into marriage. Of course, his book, Lasting Love, Enduring Secrets for Marital Success. An individual that has been a public school teacher, a trial attorney, and even more recently, a radio broadcaster and, of course, an author. And, of course, the Daily Show Viewpoint is one that he is part of. So, Charles, welcome back to Point of View.
Well, Kerby, it's good to do a little do-si-do with you again.
Well, I'm looking forward to this. Let's talk about the importance of fathers and their foundation. You start the first chapter by talking about the Titanic. People might say, well, how does that relate? Well, you do go into the fact that there were structural problems in the Titanic, a problem of a false foundation, which they actually were able to retrofit on the Olympic, but weren't able to fix in the Titanic. And so it was, in some respects, almost destined to go down. I think that's a great illustration, as you use, for the fact that if we don't start with a biblical foundation, a moral foundation for families, it's going to be real easy for us to face what you call end times deception. Tell us more.
Well, there's no question about it, but the problem is that 1,500 folk went down into Davy Jones' locker as a result of the construction failures of the Titanic. Those were fundamental failures, and in our lives today, we have some profound fundamental failures in morality, but more than that, fundamental failures in spiritual foundations. And think of it this way. Almost all of those that went down with the Titanic were men, most of them fathers. The question is, what legacy did they leave? What legacy did they leave? Now, here's the interesting thing. When those men, together with their families, went out on the Titanic, they went out in great pride. They thought they had the world by the tail. I mean, this was the maiden voyage of the greatest ship ever to sail the seas. And they were celebrating. This was a big deal worldwide, but they didn't make it. I don't think a lot of fathers realize that they might not make it. They might not make it tomorrow. They might not make it next week. And the question is, what legacy will they leave?
And
when
really,
we talk about legacy,
yeah,
we're not talking about money. We're talking about the meaning of their life. What legacy will they leave? To me, that's one of the most important things that I consider in my entire life, more important than 20 years of a successful trial practice, more important than 9 years of successful school teaching, more important even than 35 years of pastoring and 24 years on the air like you. But the most important thing is, what legacy will I leave with my children and my grandchildren, 10 of which I have, and 5 of which are in my home right now.
Wow. And again, the subtitle of the book is Hearts of the Fathers, Leaving a Legacy That Lasts. Let's talk about that, because you just told us what legacy isn't. It isn't the financial resources you leave behind, though that may be significant, but it's the name, it's the credentials, it's the character, it's the passing the spiritual baton on from one generation to the next, isn't it?
Well, it is. And this is the reason, Kerby, why in the last book of the Old Testament, God, our Father, gives special focus to the whole issue of fathers. From his viewpoint, he considers fathering to be preeminent. And so much so, and he knew what was going to happen in these end times where we're living. He knew that fathering was going to fall on extremely hard times. And so, just before 400 years of prophetic silence there in the book of Malachi, he said that before the great and terrible day of the Lord, in other words, before the Lord's return and his pouring out of his wrath on the children of disobedience, he's going to send forth in mercy and in compassion the spirit of Elijah the prophet to call the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to the fathers. Wow. That was a great act of mercy, and we're in that moment right now, and that is what precipitated my motivation to write this book.
We need to take a break, but let me just mention real quickly that, first of all, we have a link to your website, and you can find that very easily at Save US or Save America, and we also have a link to this book, which you might be able to find in your local bookstore, Hearts of the Fathers, Leaving a Legacy That Lasts, but we do have a link there so you can get it in hardback and also Kindle. And it is a book that's actually been out for a while, and we wanted to focus some time and attention on that. And when we come back from the break, Charles, I want to talk about this idea of fatherlessness. That is a topic we've addressed for many years, and as a matter of fact, my co-host on Friday will be Colonel Alan West, and he spends a fair amount of time talking about that because as he, looking at that, what's happened in the black community, says that is a real concern. And so I want to get into that because that's really something that you address quite a bit in the book. And again, this is a book that will help you not only understand how to be a good father and to think about the legacy that you lead, but more importantly, just to understand some of the cultural circumstances that we find ourselves in today and why, in many cases, we're pointing to the wrong solutions. But again, you get the wrong solutions if you don't understand what the problem is. Each one of the chapters ends with a series of questions, usually 4 or 5 questions, so that if you would like to use this as a teaching for men or something of that nature, that is available. There's a series of verses and quotes in the back that is useful, so it's just perfect for those of you that are thinking about something you might want to develop for the fall for a small group study or Bible study or a men's outreach. Hearts of the Fathers, Leaving a Legacy That Lasts. We'll continue our conversation with Charles right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A year ago, the FCC commissioners implemented the Restoring Internet Freedom Order. At the time, critics were making apocalyptic predictions that this attempt to roll back the net neutrality rules would destroy the Internet. That is why it's worth taking a moment to see the effects of this FCC action. At the time, I suggested that these dire predictions didn't make any sense. After all, the net neutrality rules were only implemented near the end of the Obama administration. The Internet survived more than 2 decades without these rules. How could you logically argue that removing these 2-year-old rules would destroy the Internet? And I also suggested if there was a problem, the FCC or even the FTC could step in at some point in the future to fix the problem. Tom Giovannetti at the Institute for Policy Innovation makes a convincing case that the sky didn't fall. Progressive activists, he explains, were demanding that the government would implement broadband regulation. The Obama administration decided to apply to Internet providers various regulations that were written in the 1930s for the analog telephone monopoly. Experts at the time warned that these regulations were unnecessary and would most likely have a harmful impact on broadband investment, and that's what happened. Broadband investment dropped significantly in the 2 years after the Obama administration implemented these regulations. Once the FCC removed the regulations, broadband investment grew by $3 billion in 2018. Tom Giovannetti adds that broadband investment matters because broadband companies are among the biggest investors in our economy. If you look at the numbers, you can see that the sky didn't fall. Instead, removing the regulation stimulated broadband investment. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Charles Crismier with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Hearts of the Fathers. Then we're going to look at the kind of an advance at the Democrat debate coming up on Wednesday and Thursday. And, of course, next hour we'll be talking about Iran, and Craig Parshall will be with us. But, Charles, what about this idea of fatherlessness that surfaces time and time again in your book? That, you say, is one of the most significant social problems in America.
Well, it's not what I say. It's what virtually all of the social observers, both secular and Christian, are saying concerning our country. In fact, what they're doing is tracing almost all of the negative social statistics to fatherlessness. Wow. And this is a serious problem, a very serious problem. And we find it, well, it's serious for the whole country. It's particularly serious when it comes to the Black or African American community, where 70% of all Black children are born out of wedlock. And when you couple that with the divorce rate in the African American community, that actually is greater than any other demographic in our country, you have a massive, massive fatherless problem that connects with poverty. The number one cause of poverty in America is not color of the skin, it's fatherlessness. That's the number one cause of poverty. Divorce is the number one cause, plus unwed pregnancy. And you put them together and you have just a prescription for destruction of any people group. Then you look at the criminal problem, the crime problem. America's prisons filled up with such a highly disproportionate number of Black young men. Well, it doesn't take a Philadelphia lawyer to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
It's because of fatherlessness. And yet, when you have those who pretend like they're interested in dealing with these disproportionate numbers, such as a recent report that came out of the birth city of America, Richmond, Virginia, where I happen to live, and they're talking about, well, let's hold a big conference and let's really get serious about solving this crime problem. Guess what? Not once do they address fatherlessness.
Amazing.
You know why? Because it goes to sexual promiscuity, and that has become sacrosanct in our country. Sexual promiscuity. That is the number one drive of fatherlessness.
You know, one of the things that I might point out is chapter 12 in your book is one that just really goes into the details. And even though I've interviewed other people about this over the years, one of the things that really catches your attention is that now the United States is the world's leader in fatherless families. It used to be Sweden, but it has not been Sweden for a long period of time. And so we have this kind of mindset, certainly in some of the Scandinavian countries, but now even in the United States, where fathers are optional. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why, again, this book is so key, because we recognize that there are single moms that have done a good job and done the best they can trying to raise their kids. But nevertheless, we certainly don't have the ability in many cases to emphasize that. So when we come back with Charles in just a minute, we'll get a chance to get some final comments. We did lose his line there a minute ago, as you probably heard, but nevertheless, this is just an incredible number of statistics, and all of these are well documented. So when you look at children living in single-parent homes, you look at the various crime statistics and other things, this book is just a wake-up call to something I remember we talked about on this program years ago. In fact, it might even be decades ago, with David Blankenhorn, who was the first person to really start addressing this issue of fatherlessness. So if nothing else, this is just a great book, not only to encourage you as a father, if you're a man and a father, or to give to a father to encourage them, but also to encourage those of you that are really trying to keep your family together, keep your marriage together. Or even, as we said, if you're looking at many of these social problems, some of which are going to probably be mentioned Wednesday night and Thursday night in the Democrat debates, as Charles pointed out, sometimes when we try to identify some of the crime problems, some of the social problems, and all of the rest, some of the educational problems, we find ourselves in a situation where very rarely is this issue of fatherlessness actually mentioned. And if we can't get Charles back, we'll certainly try to schedule a future interview. But let me just mention that the book is not only excellent in terms of giving you biblical principles about being a father, but because, you know, he has been a teacher, a pastor, he's been a trial lawyer, and also, of course, a broadcaster. It gets into some of these social issues, and each one of the chapters ends with a series of questions. So that is something that I would highly recommend, that if you are looking for something that you might want to use as a book for a men's ministry or a small group study or something like that, it is certainly available. There's also a postscript as well. There's a series of questions. There are a couple of verses and other things. And so we'll just take our time to maybe go back and do some interviews with him in the future. But we're coming to the end of this particular hour, and so one of the things I certainly wanted to do is encourage you, as we were talking about fathers, and in just a minute as we're going to be talking about this subject of this presidential debate, to consider what you might do to support this ministry. And one of the things that we like to do from time to time is listen to some of those individuals that are actually listeners to Point of View, challenging you to give to Point of View.
Point of View has been a big tool in helping me work through what I believe and understand why I believe it, and given me the ability to argue for it and to defend it.
I am increasingly dismayed at not only the slanted coverage that mainstream media provides, but the lack of coverage. If I hadn't listened to Point of View, I mean, I know people who don't even know there's a difference between embryonic stem cells and adult stem cells, and I wouldn't have known if I had not listened to your show and I give to you guys, but I'm going to increase that amount because I think you guys are so important.
I want you to think, what would we do if we didn't have Point of View? Give something to Point of View to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
To protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
I do appreciate Point of View and what you folks are doing. You really are doing a great job to educate and to help Christian folks do a better job to honor Christ in all that we do.
Great opportunity for you to invest in this ministry. Charles Crismier, we'll get him on again in the future, and that's just a great opportunity maybe to postpone some of the conversation. But just as we're coming to a break, I did want to take a moment to really challenge you to consider what you might do as we're coming to the last week before the end of our fiscal year. We are certainly in need of financial support. It has been a lean time, and yet, as we point out even on our website, it's Morning in America. We yesterday spent a fair amount of time talking about some of these incredible religious liberty victories. Even before I came on today for my local hour, I spent some time talking about another victory from First Liberty for Trail Life, which is a Christian Boy Scouts group. And there are a variety of other victories that we're seeing in terms of the courts. We're seeing the economic dynamism of America really beginning to manifest itself, and that is certainly significant. And so there's a lot of positive things that have taken place. But of course, we still need to stand strong and to recognize that even though we are blessed by having some of these rulings going our way, there are many challenges on the horizon, and those are things we even talked about yesterday with people like Robert Knight and with Gary Bauer. And of course, we'll be talking about some of the foreign policy challenges in about a half an hour with Craig Parshall as we talk about Iran. But all that to say that we certainly do encourage your financial support. We have individuals that have supported us in the past, have given maybe a one-time gift or even joined with our truth team at $1 a day, $30 a month. But if you have listened to this program any length of time, you know that we oftentimes point out that 99% of the people that listen to Point of View have never sent even one gift. And so I want to talk to some of you that are 99%ers that have listened to the program, benefit from the program, but never taken the time to go to the website or make a phone call and say, you know, I believe what you're doing. Let me at least send a small gift. Especially at this time when we have a matching fund, that means your gift is doubled. And so please take the time to visit the website, pointofview.net. Click on that button that says Give Now, and we have a matching fund. But also, if you would like to talk to someone, the off-air line, not the one that puts you on the air, but the one that is the order line so that you can talk to someone and give that individual your credit card, is 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. It's Morning in America, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some of these presidential debates taking place Wednesday and Thursday night. All that coming up right after this.
How many times have politicians promised to defund Planned Parenthood? Vote for us, we'll do it, and nothing happens. Well, the current administration finally did something, and though it was temporarily blocked, last Thursday a 3-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit recognized the president's power, and around $60 million of our money was removed from Planned Parenthood. It was a ray of sunshine in what's becoming an increasingly tough fight. And with your help, Point of View Radio will be here to continue the winning. But that's the key phrase, with your help. Our fiscal year ends this week, and to make plans for the second half of 2019 and the first part of the 2020 election year, we need your investment right now. Go to pointofview.net, click on the banner saying Morning in America, or call 800-347-5151. And your gift will be doubled if you give right now, thanks to a special matching grant. Pointofview.net, click on Morning in America, or invest by phone, 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Let's kind of get you ready for the Democrat debates that will be taking place Wednesday night and Thursday night. We'll spend a little bit more time on that tomorrow, getting some analysis. But this is something very unusual. And for those of you that are younger listeners, younger voters, nothing like this has quite happened before. Most of the debates usually take place much later. As a matter of fact, 4 years ago, there were some people wondering whether the first real Democratic debate in August was too early. As I've been saying for months, this is June, and we have, of course, 20 of the presidential candidates that will be on the stage. Not all of the candidates will be. You have to have some kind of low threshold to make it onto the stage. And so what we will have are 2 nights, 5 moderators, 20 candidates. And, of course, a lot of people are saying this may end up being a ratings boon for NBC because they are, in a sense, pulling off what some people have called a debate palooza. And right now, the various people for NBC News and MSNBC say, I can tell you with 100% confidence that everything is going well. And we have, of course, a number of the moderators. So let me give you some of the rules. Then I want to get into some of the kinds of things that have surfaced just in the last couple of days in terms of what have become kind of Democrat issues and more promises. Matter of fact, one of the articles I've posted comes from The Economist, came out a couple of weeks ago, so it's actually a little bit behind the game because we now have people calling for reparations for LGBT people, legalizing illegal immigration, packing the Supreme Court, a few other things that hadn't even been mentioned a few weeks ago. So it's like everybody's trying to one-up themselves. But nevertheless, what we are going to be doing is having 2 nights where for 2 hours each night, candidates will have 60 seconds to answer a question and then 30 seconds for a follow-up. There'll be no opening statements, but the candidates will have closing remarks, and the 2-hour debate will kind of be split into 5 segments divided by commercial breaks. The host will be Savannah Guthrie, Lester Holt, Chuck Todd, Rachel Maddow, and Jose Diaz-Balart, and they'll be moderating the debates. Now, the candidates, at least reportedly, are timing their remarks because you really have to hit that 60-second answer. Now, some people are really gifted about this. As a matter of fact, I was just talking off air a minute ago. You know, you get on a Gary Bauer like yesterday, you can tell Gary, I need a 20-second soundbite. You can get a stopwatch. You can set your stopwatch to the 20 seconds. I mean, he is masterful at that. I know of some other members of Congress, some of whom will be with us later in the week, whose answers tend to be a little bit longer. And so they're used to not necessarily being timed. This might be an advantage for some that are a little more succinct than others. I suspect Joe Biden might have trouble making it work. Bernie Sanders might, but we'll see how it works out in terms of some of this. And so that will be kind of the debate format. First of all, let me open up some phones right now for your comments or questions. Who would you like to hear from Wednesday night or Thursday night? What are the issues you think that they're going to be bringing up? What would you hope that the moderators might ask them? Those are some questions I want to put on the table. And if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. You might say, how did they decide who gets to speak each night? Random drawing. And in some respects, Elizabeth Warren either has to be grateful for the way she drew the Wednesday night or frustrated because she won't be able to be on with the more notable candidates. Because, yes, she is on Wednesday night along with Cory Booker, Julian Castro, Bill de Blasio, John Delaney, Tulsi Gabbard, John Inslee, Amy Klobuchar, Beto O'Rourke, and Tim Ryan. If you're a real policy geek, you might know some of those names, but I would imagine a few of you are going to say, I don't know very many of those people. And in some respects, they're not as well known. Of course, most people might know Cory Booker, And certainly, of course, they would know Elizabeth Warren, but some of the more notable individuals, the ones that are doing better in the polls, are Thursday night. That will be Michael Bennet, Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, Kirsten Gillibrand, Kamala Harris, John Hickenlooper, Bernie Sanders, Eric Swalwell, Marianne Williamson, and Andrew Yang. So when you look at that, especially some of the front runners would be, of course, Joe Biden, of course, Mayor Pete, Kamala Harris, Bernie Sanders. So in some respects, Elizabeth Warren is sort of out, even though she has been actually doing very well in the polls compared, say, to Bernie Sanders. But the presumptive front runner is still Joe Biden. So that's the first issue. Those are the candidates. But what has been so intriguing is the number of kind of back and forth, which leads to one of the articles I've got in front of me here from Politico, which actually is entitled Democrat Bigwigs Fear Debates Will Devolve into Horror Show. This week's debates will be the first time millions of Americans meet the cast of Democrats trying to take out President Donald Trump. That's precisely what has the party brass terrified, it says. Interviews with nearly 20 Democratic elected officials, party chiefs, labor leaders, and operatives the past week revealed an on-air foreboding verging on alarm that the debates will generate and degenerate into a two-night bare-knuckle brawl, with the divisive 2016 Democratic primary fresh in their minds and the current presidential candidates starting to take swipes at one another. The fear is that voters will be left with an impression of a bickering, small-minded opposition party. So that will be the first issue. Certainly, what kind of swipes will be taken at Joe Biden? Since he is the presumptive nominee at the moment, he is doing better on the polls, I think in large part because of name identification. Almost every time he says something, there will be somebody that will respond. And since you have Bernie Sanders and Mayor Pete and Kamala Harris and others, I'm sure you're going to hear quite a bit. You're going to have Elizabeth Warren talking about Joe Biden when he's not even on the stage that night. So that will be the first issue. But the other one is, are these candidates making promises they cannot deliver? This particular article that came out in The Economist a couple of weeks ago is already kind of old because more recently you've had all sorts of other statements. But let's just take the article mentioning that, okay, you take Bernie Sanders, the socialist senator from Vermont, who actually wants free public college tuition and Medicare for all. You have Elizabeth Warren, who is wanting to impose a wealth tax and also bring in universal child care. And, of course, now you have a couple of them actually suggesting that you should have college loans forgiven. Bernie Sanders said that that should be another element of that. Even Elizabeth Warren said at least 95% of those loans could be forgiven. Mayor Pete says he wants to pack the Supreme Court with 6 more justices. Andrew Yang, who isn't as well known but an entrepreneur, has really talked about this idea of universal basic income, and so those are a few things there as well. And the article goes on to say that even with all these promises, even if the president, Donald Trump, loses, the Democrats are unlikely to control the Senate. Out of the 100 senators you have right now, again, the article there written by the staff of The Economist said maybe 47 could be reliable Democrats, but to win back control, you'd have to win 3 other seats, and so they spend some time talking about, well, how could that happen? They're assuming that maybe Beto O'Rourke could actually defeat John Cornyn. Don't see that happening, but that's a possibility. Then they say a couple of other things. Maybe Stacey Abrams could run for the Senate in Georgia, but she doesn't say she wants to run, and they go through a couple of others. And so pretty quickly you're down to even if you could indeed win the presidency, is it possible that Democrats could also take back the Senate, or otherwise is that going to be another example of where good pieces of legislation go to die? And, of course, that would also mean that you'd have to eliminate the filibuster. Elizabeth Warren has called for that, as has Pete Buttigieg, but then you have others like Cory Booker and Kirsten Gillibrand and Kamala Harris that are saying, well, not really, but if they wanted to, in the case of Cory Booker, get paid family leave and abortion rights, Kirsten Gillibrand wants to get marijuana legislation. I guess she wants the abortion rights. I take that back. But then also marijuana legalization for Kamala Harris and some of those others. Those are not necessarily going to get Republican votes. So this is going to be the great challenge. And we'll see whether any of the moderators say, what likelihood do we have for you actually being able to implement some of these issues? And so we're going to come back, and I'm going to give you my short list, and I do mean my short list of issues that have been promises made by these Democratic candidates. It will take me a good couple of minutes, I suspect, to go through all of them. But if you'd like to join the conversation, like to know what your thoughts are about some of the promises and the prospects of this first Democrat presidential debate, we'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Lawsuits exist to redress actual injury, but it seems that some activists think lawsuits exist to resolve offense. Well, you hear it all the time. Recently, activists complained about the presence of a Bible at a VA medical clinic. A World War II veteran donated it. He was a prisoner of war and thought it was appropriate that the VA display it as a part of a POW MIA remembrance table at the clinic. Right on cue, an angry activist sent a letter claiming offense, demanding that this historic Bible be removed. First Liberty Institute sent a letter reassuring the VA that the display is perfectly legal. We reminded them that removing any Bible from any such display could not only dishonor the memory of the brave men remembered by it, but it might actually be unlawful. Offense is not a cause of action, and the Supreme Court of the United States agrees. In Town of Greece v. Galloway, Justice Kennedy, writing for the majority, explained, offense, however, does not equate to coercion. Adults often encounter speech they find disagreeable, and an Establishment Clause violation is not made out at any time a person experiences a sense of affront from the expression of contrary religious views. So if you ever get a threatening letter that is based entirely upon someone being offended by the presence of a religious item or symbol, just ignore it. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention, next hour we're going to be talking with Craig Parshall about Iran, and we'll get into the various issues of the showdown with Iran, what could or could not be military action, if anything, diplomatic action. New sanctions have been actually placed upon Iran. That is our second article. Actually, I guess now it's the first article since we moved one of the others on our website. We will get into that in just a few minutes. But for a few more minutes, I thought I'd just talk about the debate to give you a chance to kind of think about the kind of issues that will surface. We've already talked with Charles Crismier a little bit about fatherlessness And as you hear some of these individuals talk about some of the social problems, and even though it seems like it's morning in America, economic benefits have really accrued to a lot of Americans. There are still people in poverty and still various social issues that need to be addressed. How many of those are due to what will be claimed is due to racism, discrimination, whatever? I'm not saying that that doesn't exist, but how many of those are not attributed to one of the most significant factors that I suspect won't get a lot of mention, and that is fatherlessness. The other issue is certainly one that we'll talk about in a few minutes, what they would recommend if they're going to be commander-in-chief, if he or she actually wins the presidency in dealing with Iran. But there's another one, and that is going to be this idea of immigration and citizenship. Jim Garrity wrote a very good piece today in which he said many of the 2020 Democrat presidential candidates want to fundamentally redefine who is American. That is, he says, if you show up from another country and want to be here, you ought to enjoy the full rights of citizenship and all the benefits provided to American citizens. Julian Castro really pretty much said that the other day. We want to make illegal immigration legal. So it's not, that's, this is the way, by the way, that the crime rate, I think, in some cases has gone down. We've so decriminalized so many things that, of course, the crime rate goes down. But anyway, I digress. Bernie Sanders put it this way. He said, we're going to make public colleges and universities tuition-free, open that up to the undocumented. In other words, if you're a citizen of another country and want a free college education, all you have to do is show up in the United States, get accepted at one of these 1,600 public colleges, and you're in. Whoa. Okay, that's going to create another flood of people from around the world that want to enjoy the benefits of a college degree paid for by the U.S. taxpayers. But let's just think about this for just a minute. There's more. Not only does Senator Bernie Sanders, but former Representative Beto O'Rourke say they want the United States to eliminate the citizenship exam because it's a structural barrier to immigrants. What is mean is that these are individuals maybe that lack English proficiency in speaking, writing, and reading. Also, that they don't understand civics knowledge. And it used to be a broad consensus of both Republicans and Democrats that English proficiency and knowing something about what it means to be American would be required to be a good American citizen. As Jim Garrity points out, the 2020 Democrats no longer believe this. He says 10 candidates, including Senator Cory Booker, Mayor Pete, as well as Mayor Julian Castro, Senator Bernie Sanders, and Senator Elizabeth Warren, believe that crossing the border or entering the country without permission should no longer be a crime. And so that is the case. Then we also have some others, and this would be Cory Booker, Steve Bullock, Bill de Blasio, Kirsten Gillibrand, Marianne Williamson, and Andrew Yang, that believe the federal government should not require the use of E-Verify to check the legal status of all the hires by private employers. So it will be interesting to see where these individuals come down. And even if there's a Democratic candidate that says, no, I don't agree with that, I suspect that the peer pressure might require them to believe all of these things. Here's my short list, and it is a short list. Most of these Democratic candidates believe, first of all, that we should have Medicare for all, which is single payer. Most of them have come out in one way or another to support the Green New Deal, though not all. Most all of them recognize that abortion rights is so important that they believe that abortion should be unhindered to the moment of birth. We'll leave for you to decide whether or not some of them would even say whether we should even vote for something that would allow for us to decide after a botched abortion whether somebody should be alive. Free college tuition, we've already talked about that. Already mentioned guaranteed basic income. Then for those that are working, a living wage, which would then mandate a $15 an hour minimum wage. Then, of course, we've talked about the wealth tax, which has been promoted by Senator Elizabeth Warren and others, as well. She's also promoted the idea of government daycare, and I think most of the others will come down on that as well. Then the idea of forgiving student loans has been something that's been talked about, but now we've seen a number of candidates coming out for that as well. The idea of abolishing ICE, that would be Immigration and Customs Enforcement, eliminating private health insurance, although essentially Medicare for All would do that, end the Electoral College, change the voting age to 16, then pack the Supreme Court. A couple have said that. Reparations for African Americans. Now we had one, reparations for LGBTQ individuals, and legalize illegal immigration. Okay, that's my short list, and we'll see how many of those boxes get checked out. But it just illustrates, again, some of the things we will encourage you to watch and to evaluate, and then we'll be talking more about that, not only Wednesday and Thursday and Friday, but probably in the future as well. But as we come to our break, let me just mention that we're in the midst of our fiscal year end. It ends June 30th, and essentially we stop broadcasting on June 28th. That's Friday. So we certainly need to hear from you, and if you can help us out financially, we certainly have a very significant financial need. It's been a lean year, and so if we want to end the fiscal year in the black, your gift will be very helpful. More importantly, it'll help us make us way through the summer, because summer is a time when people, as they travel, certainly sometimes forget to send gifts in, and so we do need your financial support. Let me again just go to some of our listeners to hear what they have to say about Point of View.
I really appreciate what you guys do. I love the program, and it's so refreshing to have this type of ministry on the air. And, you know, you pray that others would tune in and really get educated from a spiritual perspective about a biblical worldview. I mean, I really appreciate it.
You guys do an amazing job. You guys always are very encouraging, and no matter what, I just wanted to thank you guys.
I just wanted to commend you for the excellent guests that you've had on your program. I think all Americans need to hear these things, and I hear you say that only 1% of listeners support your program, and I just want to encourage people out there. They need to support your program because our country needs to hear these messages.
I just want to say that I love your show. I listen to it every day because I get off just in time enough to hear it, and just keep up the good work.
Just wanted to know how much I appreciate your program. I've been listening to it for several years, and thank you so much for the positions you take. Keep up the good work.
So again, just a couple of comments from listeners, and we want you to join with those individuals that have supported this ministry. And as she points out, only about 1% support us. So if you're one of those 99%, I would certainly encourage you to maybe consider making a one-time gift. And you can do so by going to the website, pointofview.net, and clicking on the button there that says Give Now. It's in our section there called Morning in America. As I said, we have a matching fund, so we certainly have an opportunity for you to double your gift. And so please take the time to visit the website, pointofview.net. We come back, we're going to talk about Iran and whether or not getting out of that nuclear deal is the reason for the belligerence of Iran. I don't believe that. But what about Iran? How do we think about this from a Christian point of view? What is the prophetic significance? We'll be talking about that. But as we go to a break, you can go to the website, pointofview.net, or you can give us a call, 800-347-5151. We'll be back right after this.
How many times have politicians promised to defund Planned Parenthood? Vote for us, we'll do it, and nothing happens. Well, the current administration finally did something, and though it was temporarily blocked, last Thursday a 3-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit recognized the president's power, and around $60 million of our money was removed from Planned Parenthood. It was a ray of sunshine in what's becoming an increasingly tough fight. And with your help, Point of View Radio will be here to continue the winning. But that's the key phrase, with your help. Our fiscal year ends this week, and to make plans for the second half of 2019 and the first part of the 2020 election year, we need your investment right now. Go to pointofview.net, click on the banner saying Morning in America, or call 800-347-5151. And your gift will be doubled if you give right now, thanks to a special matching grant. Pointofview.net, click on Morning in America, or invest by phone, 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour we're going to spend some time talking about Iran for a couple of reasons. Of course, as we well know, Iran downed a U.S. drone. And when I talk about a surveillance drone, I'm not talking about the kind that maybe you spend time looking around your neighborhood in. This is something that cost about $100 million, about the size of an airliner. There seemed to be some evidence that President Donald Trump was going to actually call for a military action, and then said that he pulled it back. We don't know whether that was a blink or a bluff. Neither matters really in the long run, but at least his argument was being told that it might lead to the loss of 150 lives, pulled back on that. And so instead, yesterday, President Donald Trump signed an executive order targeting the supreme leader and his associates, that would be Ali Khamenei, to actually limit their financial transactions. So these sanctions will deny the leader, the supreme leader in Iran, and his close aides access to money and financial support. We have an article about that on our website, and I thought it would be good to spend some time talking this through in terms of what does it mean politically, what does it mean militarily, are there any prophetic significance to it as well? And so we're going to try to get into some of those details with our good friend Craig Parshall. Been on the program with us many times before. Of course, as a lawyer, but also just an incredible writer, fiction writer who's authored or co-authored at least a dozen different suspense novels that have appeared on the New York Times bestseller list, on the CBA bestseller list. If that name sounds familiar, of course, his wife, Janet Parshall, one of the best in the business, and is a host of the syndicated radio talk show in Moody Broadcasting, Moody Radio, and, of course, also was the founding director of something I mentioned in our most recent booklet that we send out each month, our booklet on social media. I spent just a little bit of time reminding us of the history of the John Milton Project for Free Speech. Some of the concerns he was raising a decade ago are now coming to fruition. And I might just mention at that time he was actually with the National Religious Broadcasters, still serves as general counsel for them and special counsel for the American Center for Law and Justice. Craig Parshall, always delightful to have you on the program.
Oh, Kerby, the pleasure is always mine.
And I might just mention, we've also posted on our website your book, Thunder of Heaven. That came out a number of years ago. You and Tim LaHaye wrote that book, and if people are not familiar with that, it gets us into the issue of Iran. And as an individual who has been a lawyer and also doing talk shows and a variety of other things, one other aspect of that is you really had to kind of investigate what was happening in the Middle East. And so that particular novel is a Joshua Jordan novel, but it's part of a series, and it just helped you get a little better handle on Iran. And that I wanted to focus a little time and attention on because, as you well know, our friends in the State Department, some of them may be religiously oriented, but a lot of them, just religion's not important to them. So when it comes to trying to evaluate what's going on in Iran, I think they miss the religious component. And you write about that in your book, don't you?
Yeah, we sure did. Of course, Tim LaHaye was not only a friend of mine, but also a spiritual mentor. And for many years, he had been tapping me on the shoulder saying, we've got to write a fiction series together. But our schedules just couldn't meld until finally one day he said, I think I've got an idea. And I said, and I've got a schedule that's open. So we worked out this 4-book series called the End series, which was kind of a prequel to the Left Behind. We kind of cast our vision maybe 10 to 15 years in advance. Now, Thunder of Heaven was the second book. That was written, published in 2011 by HarperCollins and Zondervan. And at that time, of course, that we're talking 8 years ago.
Yeah,
we were looking ahead maybe 10 to 20 years in the near future as opposed to the far future. And but the whole 4-book series, which Tim really framed the prophecy and I just did the fiction writing and kind of the political intrigue part of it. We looked at Iran in the second book, Thunder of Heaven. And one of the things that we sort of speculated about is we know that Iran, at least the upper tier, I'm not talking about the people of Iran, because the people of Iran, there is a strong, as you know, and a lot of your listeners know, there's a strong desire for freedom among the Iranian people.
Yes.
And I follow some of the social media of some of their expatriate friends from Iran who are scattered around the world, hoping and trying to plan for a revolution to overthrow the tyranny at the top. But they have never gotten support from the United States sufficient to do that. That's a tricky question in itself, of course. But the freedom-loving people in Iran are the people suffering under this regime. It's the top tier of folks who are causing the problem, and their theology is feeding into it. The whole idea that by fomenting kind of a third world war, they could bring the 12th Imam, raise him, and suddenly their theological eschatology would be complete. That kind of thinking fuels them, the average people, yearning for freedom, hoping for a revolution, but not seeing the opportunity for it. So we got a chance to think through this 8 years ago, before Tim was elevated to heaven, and he's got the answers now. I don't on how it's going to turn out.
Yes,
but we speculated. We know the Iranian leaders have had a deep, bitter hatred of Israel.
Right.
They have been trying to mount an arsenal in terms of nuclear warheads. They have the missile power from Russia for delivery system. It's the nuclear component that they have been working on, and we tied ourselves into a nuclear deal that really did little to stop that because of the lack of verification. So Tim and I looked at this and we thought, where might this go? One possibility, and I don't want to give away the plot on that subplot in Thunder of Heaven, but Iran decides to launch an attack against Israel. That ends up to be, well, let's put it this way, a war of unintended consequences for Iran. But it does trigger the greater coalition of Russia and the Arab League to use that as an excuse to have a full-scale attack on Israel itself in fulfillment of Scripture. So that was one aspect we looked at. Would the Iranian factor, the insane lust for destruction of Israel on the part of the Iranian leadership, not the people, but the leadership, trigger events that might really thrust us into fulfillment of prophecy?
Well, again, we come back from the break. Let me talk a little bit about that, because you find that in Ezekiel 38. So that's one of those issues. But then we'll also want to look at the political issues as well, because a lot of people say, well, is it possible that that was a mistake of downing the drone? I mean, as we do know, the Islamic Republic of Iran, it is a dictatorship, but as Michael Rubin wrote in a piece that we posted a while back, not a typical dictatorship. It's where the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, actually has more kind of veto power. He gives individuals a little bit further down authority to do that. And was it maybe a general that did that, which, of course, fills into the subplot, if you will, of Thunder of Heaven. We'll also talk about Ezekiel 38 and what that might mean, as well as some of the eschatology of those in Iran and the reason why we are concerned about them getting nuclear weapons. So those are topics on the table. But let me also open up the phones. Love to get your thoughts about how to respond to Iran, how to think about it biblically. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A year year ago, the FCC commissioners implemented the Restoring Internet Freedom Order. At the time, critics were making apocalyptic predictions that this attempt to roll back the net neutrality rules would destroy the Internet. That is why it's worth taking a moment to see the effects of this FCC action. At the time, I suggested that these dire predictions didn't make any sense. After all, the net neutrality rules were only implemented near the end of the Obama administration. The Internet survived more than 2 decades without these rules. How could you logically argue that removing these 2-year-old rules would destroy the Internet? And I also suggested if there was a problem, the FCC or even the FTC could step in at some point in the future to fix the problem. Tom Giovannetti at the Institute for Policy Innovation makes a convincing case that the sky didn't fall. Progressive activists, he explains, were demanding that the government would implement broadband regulation. The Obama administration decided to apply to Internet providers various regulations that were written in the 1930s for the analog telephone monopoly. Experts at the time warned that these regulations were unnecessary and would most likely have a harmful impact on broadband investment, and that's what happened. Broadband investment dropped significantly in the 2 years after the Obama administration implemented these regulations. Once the FCC removed the regulations, broadband investment grew by $3 billion in 2018. Tom Giovannetti adds that broadband investment matters because broadband companies are among the biggest investors in our economy. If you look at the numbers, you can see that the sky didn't fall. Instead, removing the regulation stimulated broadband investment. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Socialism, go to viewpoints.info/socialism. That's viewpoints.info/socialism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us Craig Parshall, and if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll get to some of those phone calls in just a minute. I might point you to the book Thunder of Heaven. Of course, it's one of the books in the End series. But again, it was speculating at the time, Craig, about the fact that this action might bring in this coalition. And I thought for just a minute I might at least encourage our listeners, if they have a Bible, to pull out Ezekiel 38, or if they have a chance later on to look at it. First couple of verses talk about this coalition, and those names don't sound very familiar because it talks about Rosh and Magog and Meshech and Tubal and Persia. Now that works a little better because really that was the name of Iran until 1935, and Cush and Put. But when you go back and recognize that Rosh is probably Russia, Magog is probably Central Asia, Meshech and Tubal, Turkey, Cush would be Ethiopia and Sudan, Put was certainly Libya, and some of the other countries that are listed there. You might say, well, how do you know that? Well, you can go back and look at the nations of the world. You can look at those that were located there. Of course, it also talks about in Ezekiel 38, verse 2, that this was from the remotest part of the north. You go Israel and go due north, you go into Russia. And, of course, some of these other countries still have names in the recent past that match to that. Now, neither you nor I are setting dates, but we are just saying it isn't kind of interesting that Ezekiel 38 made very little sense to anybody when there wasn't a nation of Israel until 1948. And then it still didn't make a lot of sense because who would have ever thought that Russia and in Iran, at least when the Shah of Iran was there, would ever work together? But now you see, as you just pointed out a minute ago, Russia providing technology to Iran. So some of the things that have been kind of a mystery in Ezekiel 38 that Tim LaHaye's talked about, Mark Hitchcock, Ron Rhodes, maybe Gary Frazier, now seem to make a little bit more sense in light of things that have been happening in the news over the last couple of years.
Yeah, they certainly do. And I don't tout myself as an expert in prophecy or even a professional theologian, so I rely on a lot of these great theologians and prophecy experts, scholars in Ezekiel 38 and 39 to figure out the players. But it seems to me, if you read a collection of several of these reliable conservative evangelical scholars, Russia is clearly Magog. Turkey is absolutely included. And we try to figure out where Persia fits into this. And as I said, Tim and I sort of speculated, and I relied on his prophetic eye, that maybe Iran would be the trigger point. He'd be the fuse that got lit, but Iran would not be a major player. Rather, they would really set the fuse that would ignite the later attempt to invade and overwhelm Israel by the Russian-led Arab coalition. But you made a great point, as you always do, Kerby, and that is this didn't make any sense until after Israel had regathered as a nation-state, May 14th, 1948. And a lot of people think, well, that's when the UN gave it statehood. Well, not really. As a matter of fact, if you read, and I had the honor of authoring a chapter in a book recently that came out, and I was surrounded by Bible scholars, so I was, as one of my old pastors used to say, I was in pretty tall cotton. But these Bible scholars talked about how the church ought to view Israel today. My task was to write simply a chapter on how do you look at Israel if you simply use the prism of international law.
Yes.
Because international law back in May of 1948 didn't create Israel. It recognized the nation of Israel. And there's a big difference. And there were four main principles for statehood for any nation to be recognized by the international community. Israel met all four of those. By the way, they still meet all four of those as a legitimate nation state. That's why I addressed in that book. But they were recognized, but not created. They were created by the prophetic hand of God who predicted this thousands of years ago. So after it is regathered as a nation, then suddenly Ezekiel 38 and 39 makes sense now, but we don't know where it is on the clock, on the timeline.
And again, I might just recommend that book. I might also mention that we have a link to your website there, CraigParshallAuthor.com. And of course, you talked about Israel's birth may surprise you, and also get into some of the international issues there as well, which again, just a great book that I would recommend. But just before I take a phone call, let me just mention, some people might say, well, why would you say that Iran would light the fuse, but then the coalition would come together? And part of that has to do, and I would think that Tim LaHaye said it that way, because Iran is made up primarily of Shiite Muslims, which tend to be the minority.
Exactly. Yes.
Whereas these other Muslims, the Muslims in Turkey or Egypt, Libya, whatever, tend to be Sunni. So even though they're all Muslims, the animosity, as you well know, between Shiite and Sunni is pretty significant. And so I think in some respects your book had me, because I said, how would Ezekiel 38 play out? Because Iran doesn't play well with their neighbors. Well, the argument that you made is that actually they lit the fuse, and then the other Sunni Muslims came in. And so I thought I got a great, if you will, theological benefit from just a fictional book of all things.
Well, storytelling was something that Tim LaHaye really caught on to in terms of a way to transmit this broad canvas of prophecy. And I loved learning from him, because he'd often say, look, what you don't want to do, whether it's fiction or whether it's nonfiction, and he wrote tons, as you know, of nonfiction books about prophecy. And by the way, I loved the phrase he would use, which is the merciful God of prophecy. All these apocalyptic, superficially tragic events that Revelation speaks of and so forth, he said, God is attempting to get the world's attention to bring it to its knees, to worship the Savior, be saved, and be brought into the family of God. That's his mechanism. But sometimes he must shout through the megaphone rather than whisper. And that's at the end of days, you're going to see a lot of shouting through God's megaphone, pleading with mankind to come to a saving knowledge of Christ and therefore spend eternity in his kingdom by any means necessary. So that, and also another little clue that he gave me about prophetic interpretation, and that is, don't attempt to make clear what God has made vague.
Yes.
Those things that he has not clarified, we do not have a right to over-clarify. We simply need to say in many instances, God has chosen not to reveal that. I love what Francis Schaeffer said. He said, God has given us information in his word sufficient to bring us to a saving knowledge of Christ and to walk with him as necessary, but not exhaustive knowledge. The exhaustive knowledge of all of his plan won't be known until we see him face to face.
Outstanding. Let's take a break, and we have some phone calls, so I'll take those right after the break. But we are privileged to have with us today Craig Parshall. We have information about his website. We also have information about the book we mentioned. Of course, it's been out for many years, but I still think you're going to find it really helpful. And so let's, if we can, encourage you to go to the website and find out more. And as you go to the website, we also have a banner there that says Morning in America, and that is for you to give now. That button is one that I encourage you to click on because we are coming to the end of our fiscal year, and we're talking about some of these important issues, but certainly we need to hear from you. And so if you can help us out financially, we would appreciate that. As you've heard us say a couple times here today, only about 1% of our listeners do support this ministry, so I'm asking those of you that maybe have never sent a gift, even a small gift, would be greatly appreciated. It would be an encouragement to us. And as we've also mentioned, we have a matching fund, which means your gift of $50 can be $100, gift of $100 can be $200. And we'll update some of that as we go along, but it all is available at the website, pointofview.net. Click on the button that says Give Now, or if you would like to talk to someone off air, that's a different number than one I've been giving. The order line number is 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. We're going to get into a little more of the aspect of Ezekiel 38, and also, maybe before we run out of time, just talk about the Muslim eschatology. First of all, that is very different than our Christian view of prophecy, and the Shiite view is even more different again. So I won't try to get into all those details. We've had those conversations in the past with people like Joel Rosenberg and others, but I'll do my best to try to cover a little of that, and Craig will as well. So let's take a break, and we will take some phone calls, but this is a great time as we go to a break for you to visit our website, pointofview.net, or give us a call, 800-347-5151. And we have some information on the website about the sanctions on Iran. You can also find some of the previous articles we've posted on that, and that's why we're dedicating an hour today to this very important issue, which I suspect will also surface in the Democratic presidential debates taking place tomorrow night and Thursday night. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
How many times have politicians promised to defund Planned Parenthood? Vote for us, we'll do it, and nothing happens. Well, the current administration finally did something, and though it was temporarily blocked, last Thursday a 3-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit recognized the president's power, and around $60 million of our money was removed from Planned Parenthood. It was a ray of sunshine in what's becoming an increasingly tough fight. And with your help, Point of View Radio will be here to continue the winning. But that's the key phrase, with your help. Our fiscal year ends this week, and to make plans for the second half of 2019 and the first part of the 2020 election year, we need your investment right now. Go to pointofview.net, click on the banner saying Morning in America, or call 800-347-5151. And your gift will be doubled if you give right now, thanks to a special matching grant. Pointofview.net, click on Morning in America, or invest by phone, 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Privileged to have with us for a little bit longer, Craig Parshall. But let's also take some of these phone calls that have come in. So we'll go to New Mexico first. And George, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kirby, and thank you for your excellent program. My primary question was of eschatological significance, but on another, more of a practical issue, I couldn't help but wonder. That drone that they shot down was a full-sized airplane, had a wingspan, they were saying, bigger than a 737.
Right.
So I wonder, do the Iranians do we have the capability of differentiating with just a radar signature what is an unmanned airplane and a manned plane? And did they have the expectation when they fired on that plane, on that drone, that it could very well have been a manned vehicle?
Yeah, and
I
again,
wonder, or not.
Yeah, and again, I'll give you the counterpoint. They might not know, because you might remember back in 1988 when America erroneously fired on an Iranian airliner and killed all those people. Now, again, that's back in 1988, and hopefully our technology is better, but there's an example of where we fired on something we thought was a threat, and it actually killed a lot of innocent civilians. So on one sense, you could say they might not. The argument that they might is a couple of things. First of all, some of these drones tend not to fly quite as fast. And so there might be, in terms of its signature, in terms of its speed, the possibility, but I do believe that there is at least some evidence that it might indeed have been a mistake based upon a decision that was made by that particular general or those people reading the radar signature. And as a result, of course, then they tried to cover it up by saying, well, this was actually in Iranian waters. They actually claimed territorial waters all the way out 12 miles. And I think all of us have been able to demonstrate that that was in international waters. But nevertheless, just a good example of something we just don't know. But I think you had an eschatological question, so go ahead.
Yes, sir. Yes, and it involves a message that John MacArthur preached a few years ago that was actually revolutionary in my thinking. And you can find it on YouTube, actually, under the title Islam and the Antichrist.
Mm-hmm.
And he spends a significant portion in that message making the case that there is at least a very strong likelihood that the Antichrist will be Islamic. And he went through point by point through Islamic eschatology in their own writings and proved that in Islamic eschatology is very, very similar to biblical eschatology in several very distinct, detailed points, with the exception that their Christ, their Messiah, is actually, if you look at the details that they put forth, biblically, it is the Antichrist of the Bible. And our Antichrist, the true Christ of the Bible is who they consider to be, in their eschatology, the Antichrist. And MacArthur went through, and, we automatically have been thinking, when we think of a revived Roman Empire prophetically, we automatically, for obvious reasons, think of a Western Roman Empire. So we've all, for many years, we've just automatically been expecting some Indo-European Antichrist, whereas how often we forget the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Most of the lands that the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire occupied are now part of the Islamic lands, and that confederacy in Ezekiel 38 you were talking about, a lot of those are Muslim countries that constitute the confederacy of the Antichrist in that prophetic portion. So I thought that was fascinating, at least the possibility, it seems at least equally viable that it could be that, as opposed to what we were always assuming that it'd be a European Antichrist.
Well, and certainly back to the point, Craig, you and I can interact on that. The Antichrist, which you read about in 1 John and 2 Thessalonians 2 and other passages, is a powerful leader. Well, there is within Islamic eschatology this idea that there will be a powerful leader who has a lot of characteristics that look like the Antichrist. And, of course, even in Iran, there's this belief, and we won't get into it in a lot of detail, although Joe Rosenberg has talked about this idea of the 12th Imam, known as Mahdi, that they say never died, at least the Shiites believe never died, and is going to come back again in the midst of this global confrontation and maybe even something that fits into the idea of a nuclear war. But that's one of the reasons why I know you and Tim LaHaye suggested the idea that Iran might fire on Israel. They've always wanted to destroy the little Satan, Israel, and also destroy the great Satan, which is the United States.
Yeah. In fact, this is a fascinating question. Although, let me go back to the practical question that George raised, very astute, and then let me kind of pivot over to the eschatological. On this business about whether or not Iran knew whether there was a manned or unmanned drone, because it was huge. It's called the Global Hawk, and it's got a range of about 12,000 nautical miles. It can fly 60,000 feet up in the air. So this is a big monster of a drone. However, they had a chance at the same time to take down a Navy plane, the PA-8 Poseidon, which had, I think, a dozen or so intelligence staffers on that Navy craft in the air that was not shut down. No missiles even attempted to bring it down.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that Iran is playing a game of seeing how close to the cliff they could get without falling off.
Good point.
I think they had surmised, probably someone had, that this was a good way to insult America without necessarily plunging it into a war that they figure they can't win. On the other issue, this is fascinating because I had this conversation with Tim, and the question was, I said a lot of people believe in an Arab Islamic Antichrist. Well, in our series, our 4-book series, the End series, Tim and I, and this is really Tim's idea, we came up with the Antichrist character. I'm not going to tell you what book he appears, but he does make an appearance. He is Eastern European within the outer fringes of the old ancient Roman Empire, but he is thoroughly immersed in the occult. And we didn't go down the Islamic strain, but it is very possible that he could be Eastern European, non-Arab, Islamic individual, immersed in the occult. And I mention that because if you look at the history of the kind of cultural aspects of Islam in their art, in their music, and in their philosophy, they are thoroughly occultic, particularly, over this 700, 800 to about 1200. It is very apparent that the history is rooted in occultism. When Janet and I were privileged to lead another tour over to Israel recently, for the first time, we've been over there more times than I can count, but this was the only time that things were peaceful enough, quote unquote, for us to get the opportunity to get up onto the Temple Mount, which of course is controlled by the Islamic security forces. So the top of that million square foot plateau is Muslim territory. The sides and all that surrounds it is Israeli, and then that's part of the conflict. When we went up there and we were standing just, I'd say, within 50 feet of the Alaska Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, we looked at some of the tile work on the building, and it was very apparent. In fact, I took a picture of it, that there was a demonic figure depicted in the stonework of the Dome of the Rock.
Wow.
So whoever is the character that appears in the person of this Antichrist, and Revelation, if you read it very closely, the New Babylon is immersed in the occult and demonic warfare and demonic activity. So I think it is possible, and certainly Tim thought it was maybe even likely that there would be an Eastern European person who was Islamic but not Arab in terms of derivation.
Let's take a break, and we'll come back, and we'll spend just another minute or two talking about some of the striking parallels but differences between what, say, the book of Revelation says in terms of the end times and the Islamic end times, which you read about in Surah 21, 24th, first chapter of the Quran. By the way, I'm not encouraging you to read the Quran, especially not for your quiet time, but those of us that have taken some time to read can give you a little bit of an idea of some of the interesting parallels. We'll talk about that right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Lawsuits exist to redress actual injury, but it seems that some activists think lawsuits exist to resolve offense. Well, you hear it all the time. Recently, activists complained about the presence of a Bible at a VA medical clinic. A World War II veteran donated it. He was a prisoner of war and thought it was appropriate that the VA display it as a part of a POW MIA remembrance table at the clinic. Right on cue, an angry activist sent a letter claiming offense, demanding that this historic Bible be removed. First Liberty Institute sent a letter reassuring the VA that the display is perfectly legal. We reminded them that removing any Bible from any such display could not only dishonor the memory of the brave men remembered by it, but it might actually be unlawful. Offense is not a cause of action, and the Supreme Court of the United States agrees. In Town of Greece v. Galloway, Justice Kennedy, writing for the majority, explained, offense, however, does not equate to coercion. Adults often encounter speech they find disagreeable, and an Establishment Clause violation is not made out at any time a person experiences a sense of affront from the expression of contrary religious views. So if you ever get a threatening letter that is based entirely upon someone being offended by the presence of a religious item or symbol, just ignore it. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. I hope you enjoyed this episode of First Liberty Briefing. You can learn more amazing stories about how everyday Americans are standing up and saving religious freedom. Just visit firstliberty.org. You'll be inspired, educated, and informed. Visit firstliberty.org right now.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Point of View is actually a lifeline for me. I homeschool my girls, and I don't think I could do what I do without Point of View on a daily basis.
And in the absence of resources like Point of View and the silencing of the church, I think it would in effect create the silencing of the church. And that's why, again, it is so essential that that forums like Point of View and the work that you and Kerby are doing is so vital to the work of the church. And this is where listeners can be an active participant in spreading the gospel of the kingdom by supporting Point of View.
Without programs like Point of View, Ministries and Works would not have a forum that reaches the populations that need to hear the truth about the very important issues that America is founded on. So often we take what we hear for granted, the radio program or the wonderful personalities. But they can only be on if people like you and me support them.
So again, we are encouraging your financial support to Point of View. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. But Craig Parshall, for just a few minutes, I thought we might also talk about how people can connect up with you. First of all, we have a link to CraigParshallAuthor.com. And there you have your books, your blog, and other resources. There's a way in which people can contact you if they'd like to have you come and speak. And as a best-selling author, I just appreciate the fact that not only are you an outstanding lawyer, but you're also an outstanding writer. And it is amazing the incredible gifts that God has given to you. So talk about how people can connect up with you if they'd like to know some more.
Well, thank you, Kerby. And by the way, coming from a great author like yourself, that humbles me. If they want to find out more about a project that you mentioned at the beginning, my writing, of course, is on CraigParshallAuthor.com, and my books are there and some of my blog posts and other information. But if they want to find out more about the John Milton Project for Free Speech, I've recently reinvigorated that effort that was started almost a decade ago, forecasting what we're seeing now, and that is big tech is taking over the channels of communication in the digital world and deciding to censor out either conservatives or Christians or both with great vehemence. And so there's a big debate in Washington. What do we do about it? The John Milton Project is a project of the National Religious Broadcasters, where I'm general counsel. They can go to nrb.org and type in the search bar John Milton Project for Free Speech. Find out more about it there.
And I would really encourage people to do so. We send out a booklet each month. Here is the one I'm holding right at the moment on anti-Semitism, but the one that's coming out in just a few days here is on social media. And part of the booklet is just some of the concerns about how social media is retraining our brain, but most of it has to do with our concern that you are the first to really have sensitized us to years and years ago when you were at the National Religious Broadcasters through the John Milton Project. And isn't it amazing? Back then, we were talking about a few things like, well, they wouldn't allow the Manhattan Declaration app or this, that, or the other. And now, even this week, we have video evidence from a variety of different sources showing that, indeed, they are censoring and what to do about that. So you were many years ahead of the game, and we owe a debt of gratitude to you and the work that you've done through the John Milton Project for Free Speech. And so thank you for doing that, and thank you especially for being on the program with us today.
Well, Kerby, it's always a pleasure. I love your heart, but I also love your thinking, and worldview clarity is so important for folks out there right now because there's so much confusing information. Very often we just read the headlines that come down on our news feed on our iPhones and so forth. But things are coming to a head in terms of the communication world. Silicon Valley is controlling, up to now, the digital world, just a handful of these really monopolistic giants. I believe in free enterprise. I love capitalism with guardrails on it, right?
Yes.
But there are no guardrails for the Wild West frontier of Silicon Valley. And now Facebook is saying they are going to develop a digital currency. They call it a cryptocurrency, where they want to really be the world's digital currency. Now, stop and think about that for a moment.
Yeah, and that fits very much to some of the prophetic things that you and Tim LaHaye have written about. So that's another whole show, and let's do that. I am so thrilled that you've reinvigorated the John Milton Project for Free Speech, and so we'll be calling on you again. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby.
We're going to, just before I take a break, encourage you to find some of this information. If you don't know how to spell Craig Parshall's name, it's on the website, so that's real simple to find him. And I thought just for a minute I might just mention, and we'll maybe come back to this tomorrow, when we look at Islamic theology, we've pointed out, and I appreciate George pointing us to John MacArthur, who think very highly of John MacArthur. He's been on the program with us before, that in Islamic end times theology, they believe that there is going to be a day of judgment, and they even believe in trumpets, like you see in the book of Revelation. They believe that this first trumpet blast will be where everyone in heaven and earth will die except for those which Allah saves. So it's already kind of this idea of judgment. Then they also have this idea of a second trumpet, where the dead will be resurrected. And they even have something that's sort of like a tribulation, but this one's more like 40 years. There's a time after the resurrection where, according to Islamic theology, there'll be a 40-year period where people will wander the earth naked, confused, and sorrowful. And then eventually everyone's deeds will be weighed on Allah's scale. Of course, you can see that in Surah 21, this idea of like a fulcrum or a scale. And the idea of Muslims are to actually do good deeds, the 5 pillars of Islam and the other requirements, both in the Quran and the Hadith. But if nothing else, it is a reminder that we are in a dangerous time in terms of foreign policy. And it is also a reminder that those of us that look at this through the lens of Christian perspective may be able to see things that others do not. As I've said before, we have people in the State Department on Foggy Bottom that are maybe just not that influenced by religion. So when they look at Iran, they say, well, these ayatollahs, these imams are just using religion to advance their power. Well, that may be true, but they really do believe some of this as well. And so this is something where we need to be thinking about this from a biblical point of view. And so this is one of the things we try to do so often here on Point of View. And if you find yourself saying, wow, I heard a lot of stuff today, Ezekiel 38, and we're talking about the Muslim idea of an Antichrist, and we're talking about a day of judgment, I hope that you'll just stay with us every day as we try to unfold more of this on the program. But as we do that, we do need your financial support. So if you have been thinking about supporting this ministry, we're going to go off the air in just a minute or two, and we will still take phone calls. And that number to call, if you would like to put a donation on your credit card, is 800-347-5151. Or you can simply go to the website, pointofview.net. And as you go there, you'll find a couple of different things. You'll find, for example, an article about the sanctions on Iran. You'll see some information about the interview we did with Charles Crismier on the hearts of fathers. You'll see information about Craig Parshall's book, Thunder of Heaven. You'll see my Viewpoints commentary today on the net neutrality rules that were removed a year ago, and we didn't see the end of Islam or anything like that. So we really are able to cover a lot of different issues, and it's all available at the website, pointofview.net. So as you go there, click on that button that says Give Now and give to this ministry, and we would greatly appreciate that as well. I want to thank everyone who has been involved in this broadcast today, Doug and Steve and Connor. Thank you for joining us, our new intern who is part of this as well. And we hope that you will join us tomorrow. Boy, we still have a lot more to cover, and we will do so right here on this program called Point of View.
It's amazing but true. When it comes to one of America's biggest household expenditures, healthcare, a lot of people think they've got no choice. People are used to thinking we have to do it this way, but they don't. Yes, you have the freedom to choose an alternative with your healthcare. It's MediShare, and it costs way less than the alternatives. The typical family saves $500 a month, not a year, a month. And if you're single, this can save you a lot too. And let's face it, a big reason MediShare is 400,000 people strong, it just works. They've shared over $3 billion in medical bills, so they can help share your needs too. Joining MediShare for so many people is one of those things that makes you say, why didn't I do this before? So yes, the time has come for something better. Look into joining MediShare and see why so many people are opting out of the old way and into the new. Why not look into this? Just call 855-90-BIBLE. That's 855-90-BIBLE. 855-90-BIBLE.
It takes a team to win. Be part of Point of View's Truth Team and bring truth and healing to America. Go to pointofview.net/team, pointofview.net/team, and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.